Hello and welcome to Hug and the Snug, where today I'm joined by Andrew Eagles, the Managing Director of Sustainable Homes, who are a consultancy working with social housing providers. Is that all right?
Yes, that's
okay.
good.
Can we start in the usual fashion with a hug?
Yes.
So today we're going to talk about resilience in housing provision and whether eco-measures have now become survival tools. So there's two key parts to that question that probably need defining before we go into the question. What do we mean by eco-measures and what do we mean by survival? So maybe if we start with survival, what would you say are the greatest challenges facing social housing providers?
A really good question to start with. Thanks a lot. So in terms of survival, what we're seeing is an increasing rate of people being flooded. So in the next 15 years we'll see a 20% rise in the number of people being flooded. It's quite a big issue. We're seeing some quite significant other issues as people improve their housing stock, make them more energy efficient. We're seeing issues around ventilation and overheating. But some of that is happening irrespective of those improvements. So the urban heat island effect means that properties in inner cities are overheating, and that makes us tremendously vulnerable to the warmer temperatures we're seeing in the summer. So those are some of our survival issues, and it might sound a bit over the top and it might be a bit cliched, but these are really about survival. In 2003 there was 2,000 excess summer deaths during that very hot period. Lots of people might have quite enjoyed it, but the elderly and the more vulnerable did suffer during that warmer temperature. So those are real, tangible survival issues. So working in sustainability in buildings, we're looking at reducing carbon emissions, but we're also looking at how we have to adapt to our changing climate.
Okay, so actually to then ask you what we mean by eco-measures feels like a bit of a lightweight question, given what you've just talked about. But there is still a kind of perception that eco-measures are kind of an add-on or a nice to have. Would you say that's true? That there's still some work for people to be done to align those two things?
Yes, I think that's a valid point. The starting slide we start with is about quality of life. And where we want to move to is an understanding that a more sustainable home leads to a higher quality of life. And by that we mean broader things than just eco. So something with better sound insulation means the kids get more homework done. It means there's more daylight into the home, lifts people's energy levels. All these really positive things are tied up with also a house being more sustainable. Now, part of the challenge we also face is that most of the sector and most of those interested are generally focused on mitigating CO2. So that's around things you'd commonly understand: energy efficient light bulbs, insulation, solar panels, and these are great, and we're really moving forward with that agenda.
So it's focused on reducing CO2 emissions.
Reducing CO2 emissions, yeah, exactly. So part of what we want to try and get into the discussion is a consideration also of including adaptation measures. And that's things like being aware of the risk of flooding, making the property resilient and resistant to flooding, and those issues of overheating, because that's the change we're seeing in the climate means more people are at risk, and those can have a real detrimental impact on people's lives as well.
And it's interesting talking about adaptation, because I think the scary thing about adaptation for people is that it acknowledges that there are difficult times ahead. And sometimes that's very difficult for people to accept and to embrace, quite understandably. Is that something that you find with housing providers, that, how do you find their willingness to accept those difficulties?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. We independently assess how sustainable they are, and I only bring that up because when we started there wasn't much awareness of things like the risk of flooding. We're seeing more awareness now, but even still there's still a significant misconception. So talking to a landlord yesterday of over 20,000 homes, So she commented as an asset manager, well, flooding's not an issue for us because we're in London. Now, a lot of the flooding issues we face, you're smiling because surface water runoff. So I lived in Brixton for 3 years. We were flooded twice because the capacity, the drainage size hasn't increased. The pipes haven't increased for years. Getting heavier rainfall in a shorter period of time. And those incidences are increasing. So people are being flooded in places not next to rivers, not next to the sea. And that isn't understood.
Yeah. And do you find that, because quite often within organisations you have a sustainability manager, are they also the people who are tasked with dealing with adaptation? Or because our question is, are eco measures and survival the same thing? That would also require it being the same person who's trying to deal with both of those challenges.
Yeah.
Do you find it is the same person or different parts of the organisation?
So often it isn't, and so that's part of the challenge, I think, to get this message taken up by the breadth of people within landlords, and it's private landlords as well, and we have done some work with private landlords. So often there's a sustainability person, and then the usual remit is to get carbon emissions down, say, of the office, and maybe start to consider about other things, wider insulation, because government's been sponsoring that. But the people dealing, say, with flooding or discomfort might be the people at the neighbourhood level or the community support level, and so sometimes there's not that tie-in. Really, it's about getting it to the directors of asset management to start considering this and trying to reduce the risk later on.
And given that there can be that disconnect between sustainability and survival within an organisation, do you think the fact that more and more we're all being affected by the kind of things that you're talking about, flooding, overheating, and we can see quite clearly that those are going to be really serious problems in the near future. Do you think that urgency is helping organisations to put sustainability, that there is an opportunity for organisations to realise that a greater focus on sustainability, greater integration of sustainability beyond just CO2 reduction can really help them prepare for those challenges? That it may be something that can actually accelerate the changes they need to make?
Yeah, it's an interesting time because we've seen significant drop in the support for environmental initiatives from government. So we've seen a reduction, a falling away of the code for sustainable homes, so government's supporting that for new build homes. So that's a big change. And we've just lost £1.6 billion funding a year through ECO, the energy company obligation. So what's interesting is despite that, we are still seeing quite a few clients interested in talking about these issues. And I think that's because there's an inherent understanding that change is happening. In the longer term, we do need to reduce our CO2 emissions. There's the Climate Change Act 2020 targets, but also an awareness of the broader benefits for quality of life for people. So it's good that irrespective of that overlying dark cloud,
yes.
and in both senses, I guess, that they're still taking action.
And would you say that the social housing sector is leading the way in terms of their adoption of both mitigation and adaptation measures, as well as some of the stuff you're talking about in terms of improving quality of life?
Yeah, I would, and I think they should be really proud of that. So the energy efficiency of their homes on average is far greater than the average for private sector rented stock. They're engaged with their residents on some of these issues. Particularly the landlords we work with are communicating with residents on things they can do, mainly mitigation measures, and that's something that is really positive, and it's about creating that community which you mentioned before. I think there's that tie back. I think there's more that can still be done, and it could be more precise and more tailored, and that's what is really important to do. And some areas aren't focused on as much, so just very briefly, but so water efficiency, for instance, the heating of hot water accounts for over 23% of our energy bill. So we could do more on that.
And so, as a kind of a learning from our conversation today, what would you say let's say take the housing sector as a whole can learn from the good practice of what you're seeing happening with social provision?
So fundamentally they could build to more sustainable levels in new build housing. So instead of just the minimum and building regulations, they could engage with people in the homes a lot more, and that's around mitigation but also around preparing for flooding, around leading a sustainable lifestyle in terms of waste, other elements, transport, those sorts of things. And that has long-term benefits for quality of life, enjoyment of life. And then perhaps most importantly for the conversation today, and in light of the terrible flooding that people have suffered in the last 2 months here in the UK, they could think about the risks from surface water flooding, from overheating, because those can have a real impact.
So it sounds like it's about sort of being real about the risks that we face and taking the necessary measures to deal with those challenges, but also that there's quite a positive message there about what can be achieved for taking a long-term view, improving people's quality of life. I mean, I guess there's nothing more important in some ways than where we live and what we call home. Yeah, exactly. So home can have a tremendous impact for improving well-being. It's nice to be part of it. Yeah, great. Thank you very much for joining us here in Hug and the Snug.
Thanks so much.
Bye now.